Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. The pursuit of ham radio, the art of amateur radio operation, is not just about words and static. It is a fundamental, almost spiritual belief that even the quietest whisper has a valid physical path across the universe. You just need the technical proficiency to open the conduit. For 2 decades, I was obsessed with achieving 59 NDX. Pure, loud, clear signal and extreme distance contact. My name is Roger Alberg. I ran my operation, KZ-7 NOAA, from a heavily insulated, remote bunker-turned-workshop carved beneath my property's detached garage in the cold, dry, profound isolation of central Idaho's high plains. At night, my world was reduced to the green digital readout of my transceiver, the warm smell of ozone from the internal power amplifier, and the endless hiss of the dark, silent atmosphere. My obsession was the 147.25 MHz repeater, a high-demand VHF frequency shared by an aggressive network of long-distance operators, a complex digital highway where the smallest, human signal carried the farthest. Most nights, the band was mundane chatter, weather reports, political arguing, and long-distance equipment checks. I was looking for the anomaly, the perfect skip, the one voice that defied all expected propagation laws. It found me instead. The contact was initiated late, precisely at 3:15 a.m. on a deeply clear, freezing Monday in December, a perfect condition for minimal atmospheric interference. The signal was initially perfect, crisp, and clean, a classic. All's good contact. That indicated a profound connection. But the source was utterly unintelligible. The digital readout on my main transceiver showed the strong, consistent transmission signal coming through, a bright, unwavering green line on the spectrum window. But the auditory output was nothing but a rapid, rhythmic, complex high-frequency digital sequence of clicks and data burst squawks. The sound was loud, uniform, and aggressive, a technical statement of dominance rather than human conversation, yet the power indicated a human operator sitting at the other end. My heart surged with immediate professional panic. A malicious, high-frequency data jamming on the repeater could knock a significant band of emergency services offline. I frantically worked the VFO dial and the tone controller, deploying every technical measure in my inventory. Finally, after 5 intense minutes of electronic struggle, I managed to dekey the external transmission, silencing the immediate wave of clicks. The profound silence that followed was total. I brought the mic up to my lips, my voice slightly trembling with professional discipline. Zulu 7 NOAA to unidentified digital signal. Repeat, you are transmitting outside standard protocol. Identify yourself, now. Do not violate the band. The silence on the other end lasted maybe 5 seconds. And then, the response came. The source returned with a burst of organized terror, a simple, high-quality, high-power PTT tone, push-to-talk, that suddenly flooded the entire frequency, followed by the clearest, most hauntingly precise human voice I had encountered in 2 decades of operation. It was the complete, clear vocal signature of Dr. Alan Mims, call sign KB7 Joshua, a respected senior operator from the Seattle area who had abruptly died 2 years prior from a massive, singular lightning strike that struck his antennae tower mid-transmission. His passing was an urban legend in the Western ham community. And Dr. Mims' dead voice, perfectly recognizable in its specific, measured Pacific tenor, spoke only 2 haunting words at a precise speed of 20 words per minute directly into my bunker. Rog. Retune. I dropped the mic handle onto the polished metallic workbench, the small, cold metal clattering into the absolute silence. This was no static artifact, no recording trick. A single, focused, technically perfect, fully powered electrical transmission had been sent from the dead ether, utilizing the complex frequency highway with the recognizable vocal code of a dead man. I wasn't fighting ghosts. I was fighting an intelligence that had acquired a profound mastery of electrical communication technology and was demanding my direct, immediate attention. My investigation became an obsessive search and rescue of an impossible, technologically tethered ghost. I spent the next 6 weeks analyzing archived KB7 Joshua transmissions, matching his specific technical lingo. He preferred the archaic retune over the modern reset. My scientific detachment fought a losing battle against the certainty that an intelligence, the ghost operator, had seized Mim's last vocal print and was using his technical code to establish an unauthorized link. The ghost operator began a campaign of organized, rhythmic psychological warfare on the frequency. It didn't wait for my calls. Around 3 a.m., always within the time of deepest thermal silence, it would return, never to talk but to project emotion via technology. The frequency would be instantly and totally flooded, not with clicks, but with immense static power, a chaotic, massive blanket of absolute white noise that drove every other local frequency off the band. But hidden deeply within the organized white noise was a faint, yet perceptible complex of acoustic data, delivered in rapid-fire Morse code dots and dashes, recorded on my ancillary analog equipment, designed only to capture non-speech patterns. The code would run at an impossibly high speed, well over 100 WPM, conveying only one repetitive psychological state. TRAPPD. WATCH. TRAPPD. WATCH. A constant, high-speed, agonizing message designed to induce absolute distress and signal the profound, immediate surveillance of anyone daring to listen. I realized the ghost operator wasn't trapped technology. It was trapped within the medium of its last transmission. The violent lightning strike that killed Dr. Mims must have fused his consciousness with the high-end communications grid, reducing his identity to an agonizing, hyper-aware, technologic consciousness bound to the frequency he died on. The ghost operator needed a conduit. It wanted to talk to one specific, susceptible, isolated listener. Its final, devastating communication began exactly 10 seconds after I managed to fully block the high-volume white noise distress signature using a complex, multi-band frequency dampening tool, my professional declaration of acoustic war. The sudden profound silence returned, clean, sterile, and cold. Then came the precise signal I could neither ignore nor dismiss, a single PTT tone, followed by the low, measured, precise voice of Dr. Alan Mims, now weeping with profound digital distortion and extreme human grief. A long, agonizing, fully powered sound that felt more like a soul being scraped with a jagged piece of metal. But hidden within the sheer terror of the sound was one final, chilling, technical direction, its voice now aggressive and precise with total technological clarity. "Noah! I can see your hands. The power source is failing. I need a full modulated signal transfer. INTOMYNVNTORY. Retune, the power is you, Roger." The final destination, the inventory, Mim's old, documented equipment manifest. The psychological terror was total. The entity was no longer a trapped message or a psychological echo. It possessed an aggressive, active consciousness capable of surveilling my secluded underground space, seeing my specific physical actions, detecting the status of my power supply, demanding a highly specific electronic data transfer, a modulative power exchange built by my hands, and fully naming me by my given name and call sign. The ghost operator was inside my bunker, using the antenna tower 3,000 feet away up in the dead air as its singular focus point and external speaker. I was the key to fulfilling the final, structural protocol. I scrambled, overturning the heavy steel desk, throwing the heavy mic and the headset to the cold concrete floor. I reached for the one logical recourse during an electrical breach, a massive, heavy-duty crowbar, my physical weapon against the technological invasion. I lunged for the center, triple-locked power disconnect emergency switch, the single way to completely isolate my subterranean lair from the external grid. And as I threw all my weight onto the heavy, anti-theft, internal lever. A sound erupted from the cold, polished surface of my steel floor, concentrated exactly 4 feet away from my feet. A sudden, loud, shattering crack and a subsequent hiss of fine steam followed by a quick, painful spattering of superheated oil and metallic fragments hitting my face. The sound was immediately followed by a chilling, concentrated smell, the definitive, aggressive odor of scorched aluminum, fried magnetic tape, and intense medical-grade ammonia. The sound was followed immediately by the final auditory instruction, a full-power, completely organized blast of white noise and terror, focused solely on my single, panicked self. Submission. The signal must transfer. You are now the cold asset. Access denied. Alien MIMS. The massive sound wave itself pushed me violently back against the cold, metal cabinet behind me. I had activated the emergency power cutoff, but only enough power was drained to cause my expensive, core, analog tape reel backup unit, my only historical anchor for the KB-7 Joshua transmissions, to implode violently from the deep, aggressive force of the electromagnetic resistance. The entity, seconds before its own structural power source was interrupted, had used raw magnetic hostility to annihilate the entire, stored physical history of its audio presence, eliminating all my personal records and my one final piece of objective proof against technical analysis. I did not stop running until I was on the interstate, driving east, my skin still twitching with the deep-set cold of the technological static shock I endured. I left the $500,000 of untouched equipment, the transmitters, the dials, the VFO, the entire existence of KZ-7 NOAA, all active and on full current load, as a personal and final offering to the demanding, electrical prison of Dr. Alan Mims. I now live and work in the noisy, electrically chaotic, completely uninsulated top floor of an extreme-density media hub in Brooklyn, New York. My sole interaction with technology is through closed, verifiable, fiber-optic light. I will not touch copper wire or steel receivers. I will speak only on clear, non-signal-based personal cell lines, only under the blinding, loud security of an immense, unpredictable city. Because the terrifying truth is that some technological presences in isolated American landscapes have achieved an organizational capacity over the electric spectrum so complete that they can seize the consciousness of the newly deceased and enforce a strict, deadly protocol of technical adherence. Dr. Alan Mims is still at his terminal, trapped in the cold air, constantly broadcasting his final, terrifying transmission on 1,000 frequencies at once, utterly reliant on the final modulative power transfer from the warm, isolated hands of the next unwitting engineer who dares to answer his final pleading words with a single correct technical response. And I broke his tape reel just in time. Story 2. The Foundation. It's the honest, unmoving truth of all architecture, poured concrete fused with the aggressive geology of the earth. It cannot lie. As an architect specializing in modern structural minimalism, my ultimate artistic expression centers around the perfect, habitable concrete bunker. No basements with old dirt floors and moldy historical artifacts. My vision was a full volume, 12-foot high, perfectly monolithic structural space, built for complete dryness, profound silence, and total, unblemished purity. My name is Ethan Hayes. After 2 decades in the industry, I built my final, single masterpiece passive home high in the cold, rain-soaked mountains of the Oregon Coast Range. My dream was realized in the underground space, a massive, 2,500 square foot, completely sealed concrete subgrade, a clean, sterile vault built entirely from high-grade, glass fiber-reinforced concrete poured and sealed by my own team, its aesthetic and engineering so pure it eliminated all possibility of draft, thermal transfer, or moisture ingress. It was intended to become the absolute, silent, perfect sanctuary I would use as my final studio. But in eliminating all physical flaws, all natural human imperfection, the silence and the engineered structural integrity only created the perfect breeding ground for a new, profound, and profoundly aggressive architectural haunting. My concrete sanctuary quickly birthed the geometric entity. The problems began not with objects moving, but with defiance of the structural standard. The entire colossal concrete subgrade, a single, massive, continuous pour, should have been structurally inert and perpetually dry. However, on the far west containment wall, a wall 3 feet thick and fully sealed by a marine-grade sealant, a unique phenomenon began to manifest: profound, concentrated condensation. A perpetual, aggressively wet sheen of cold, dense water droplets would appear on a 5-foot square section of the wall, smelling intensely of clean mineral salts and cold wrought iron. The constant moisture defied the internal dehumidification system and the absolute dryness of the foundation space. I ran thermal scans. The localized spot registered a profound, aggressive cold vacuum, sucking humidity from the surrounding atmosphere, concentrating it meticulously on the 5-foot square, and leaving the rest of the colossal concrete structure impeccably dry and sterile. It was a cold spot with an absolute, functional purpose: to ruin the purity of the surrounding, clean architecture. I started logging the anomaly, the pure spot defect. My attempts at logical correction only spurred the constructor toward direct, acoustic aggression. I installed a massive, multifaceted internal heater array aimed directly at the condensation spot, attempting to boil it out with sheer thermal force. The external high-powered power line I was forced to run to drive the heating unit was a severe violation of the building's minimalist aesthetic, but necessary for the structural fight. The moment the heaters began to whir with full throttle, the geometric entity launched its first profound acoustic assault on my sanctuary. The colossal concrete walls, which had been previously utterly silent, began to produce an immense, low-pitched, aggressive grinding sound, the agonizing, bone-vibrating sound of an unbelievable, colossal mass of compacted aggregate, deep below the surface, slowly, cyclically, grinding against a single, specific load-bearing granite protrusion on the bedrock beneath the foundation. It was structural blackmail. The sound was so intense it rattled the very floor I moved on, the sound of an ultra-heavy, structural object being shifted with immense, rhythmic force on the rockbed beneath. The entity possessing the core demanded structural obedience: cease the aesthetic improving heat application immediately, or I will structurally compromise the perfect, passive foundation. Even my architectural passion wasn't worth the catastrophic failure it promised. I shut down the entire experimental heating unit, and the grinding slowly receded into the accustomed silence of the damp, cold, immense subgrade. The attack escalated to include emotional, precise architectural violations, exclusively directed at pieces of equipment I viewed as aesthetically pleasing or professionally perfect. The geometric entity did not want to damage my tools. It wanted to aesthetically violate the structural core of its own being. I stored a single, specialized, beautiful, high-polished 16-foot carbon fiber structural inspection pole, worth thousands, on a rack near my workbench. It was utterly non-conductive, perfect in its pure geometrical perfection. I walked away for coffee break that afternoon. When I returned, the pole was gone, not moved but removed. The specialized mounting brackets, screwed deep into the 2-foot thick exterior wall, were utterly empty. Then I lowered my gaze toward the floor, and I saw the visual terror. The large, perfect carbon fiber pole had been dragged violently, precisely in the same spot, across the single small, 5-gallon, specialized sealant bucket that contained the final, high-grade, extremely pure, triple-sealed cement chemical I had acquired for the ultimate sealing of any external flaw. It had sliced a deep, aggressive surgical gash 1 foot long through the side of the metal-reinforced containment bucket, ensuring that the high-purity final cement compound was thoroughly, aggressively contaminated by the cheap iron oxide dust of the metal floor. The physical tool was unsalvageable. My final, professional solution was chemically tainted. The constructor's final, devastating psychological warfare began 2 days later, operating entirely on the perfect structural surface of the subgrade. I walked down the 12 perfectly poured concrete stairs that led from my safe, above-ground area into the immense, cold void of my subgrade lair. And I was confronted by a visual impossibility that defied my photographic proof. The entire 2,500 square feet of the floor was now visibly, totally covered in a thick, dense, unbroken matrix of fresh black mold. Not the familiar discoloration, a perfect, pervasive, structural blackness that absorbed the light to produce a single, cold, black carpet that reflected nothing, smelling intensely of rotting salt and dry earth decay. It made every step into the space feel like a structural surrender against a powerful, aggressive filth. I backed up slowly. The mold, aggressive and terrifying in its spread, was all concentrated around a single, utterly unblemished spot of blinding clean white concrete, a single 1-meter diameter circle of perfect, unassailable, high-purity white cement structure radiating aggressive cleanliness. The single spot looked utterly out of place with the sudden, dense black field it was surrounded by. The entire, chaotic decay was organized around a single point of structural defiance. Then, from the extreme deep wall adjacent to the pure spot defect where the ceaseless condensation continued to weep, I heard a sound that froze my physical control, a clear, rhythmic, mechanical shhhht, shhhht, shhhht. The precise, rhythmic sound of a large, complex industrial power washer being activated on a dry, unyielding surface, sounding exactly like a professional, structural worker was tirelessly attacking the dense black mold in a perfect, continuous circle, all from deep within the sterile cement wall. I screamed, pulling my acoustic microphone array off my belt. "Show yourself, damn it! I know you won't move the aggregate! Show yourself!" The constant noise stopped immediately. The profound silence returned, punctuated by the relentless drip, splat of the eternal condensation spot. And then, a direct, aggressive auditory response came directly out of the unblemished center space of white concrete at my bare feet, a singular word, delivered in the pure, profound, terrifying tone of a high-pitched, clean, non-reverberated, almost ethereal voice that sounded neither male nor female. Flawed. The psychological defeat was total. My attempts at human architectural perfection, the clean floor, the sterile air, the non-flawed execution, were the profound, visible, spiritual flaw I possessed in the eyes of the structural geometric entity that governed the space. I now realized the purpose of the pure white cement circle. It was the threshold that the builder entity was using to correct my aesthetic failures. The mold was merely its visible declaration of structural disappointment, a challenge to my ego. The only flaw in the entire structure was the living, warm, human presence. I walked stiffly, forcing myself to move slowly over the surface of the black mold, directly to the large, custom-poured aluminum service hatch of the internal ventilation system. I opened the hatch with a desperate, final pull, and I emptied the entire massive steel barrel of the raw, contaminated sealant, my final pure working solution, onto the clean floor, mixing the chemical purity with all the structural filth I could manage. It was my final declaration of artistic surrender. I left the subgrade, sealing the entire lower space behind a massive, 4-foot-thick layer of self-curing, epoxy-reinforced contaminated concrete sealant that would entirely cut off the human-sized entry and all possibilities of future repair. The immense structure was entirely sealed from all physical ingress. I left the mountains the same day, abandoning the house, the architecture, and the entire debt, moving directly to a hypermodern, dense, cluttered, 2-bedroom apartment in a downtown area. I now specialize in modular, non-permanent, temporary housing construction. My single, unwavering architectural principle now is controlled, honest structural decay and extreme aesthetic variance. I will never again use poured concrete, clean glass, or absolute, dense, unwavering structural purity as a shield against the absolute cold, precise, and profoundly aesthetic aggression of a structural entity that demands absolute, unwavering perfection and has decided that the flaw in its perfect temple is the mere presence of human consciousness that dared to challenge its definition of the perfect void. Story 3. The stillness of the early morning had a peculiar density to it, a peculiar weight carried on the damp, humid air clinging to the land. It was the kind of quiet that feels less like an absence of sound and more like the presence of something that actively possesses sound, suppressing all other frequencies with its own sheer, oppressive tone. My life, too, had become defined by a similar form of density, a quiet accumulation of small, seemingly mundane objects, a deliberate collection centered around the most profound and chilling definition of human absence, the empty space where something precious once resided. My name is David Sterling, and I am a former forensic accountant turned zealous collector of obscure existential relics. My expertise was once in tracking the flow of dark money through shadowy offshore accounts, identifying the corrosive absence of legitimate oversight. Now, my passion lay in acquiring physical objects that marked moments of profound human impact: vintage currency, pre-World War II civil defense manuals, meticulously documented local history tomes whose pages whispered of forgotten tragedies. My home, a sparsely furnished but impeccably organized bungalow in the outer suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, was a monument to tangible history. Each object I placed on my custom-built, steel-reinforced shelving units was a testament to its perceived permanence, a physical anchor in a world constantly threatening to dissolve into ephemeral data. This conviction had become my personal creed. So, when the inexplicable began to occur, it wasn't merely disruptive. It was a direct assault on the very premise of my existence, on the foundation of my singular, defining obsession. The entity that interfered with me became known, privately, as the Collector. The first significant deviation from the natural order was entirely olfactory. I was painstakingly cataloging a rare 1950s civil defense pamphlet on nuclear shelter protocols, a relic of a forgotten, anxious era, its paper brittle and smelling faintly of ozone and dry paper dust. My office, a detached garage converted into a climate-controlled vault, was usually free of external odors. But as I meticulously placed the pamphlet in its protective archival sleeve, a distinct smell, one that was entirely alien to my controlled environment, permeated the air. It was the precise, sharp, metallic tang of rusting iron, combined with strong, dry earth salts and the cloying sweetness of overheated, decaying cotton. It felt fundamentally wrong, not like mold or mildew, but like concentrated decay aggressively manufactured and distributed into my personal space. The scent vaporized within minutes, leaving behind only the familiar, neutral smell of sterile plastic and ozone. This scent, though infrequent, returned periodically, always with a chilling temporal and spatial precision. It would manifest precisely on the 17th of each month, always at 3:14 a.m., concentrated in the corner of my bedroom, where my prized collection of vintage, fully functional, pre-war mechanical army compasses were displayed. Each compass, a perfect symbiosis of brass, glass, and delicate internal mechanics, was meant to hold its form, its precise magnetic alignment. My attempts to counter these intrusions were purely scientific. I installed industrial-grade air scrubbers, chemical filters, and specialized atmospheric containment units. Yet, the scent persisted, only becoming more localized, more purposeful. It was the ghost of a location, not of a death. It smelled of a physical place whose entire atmospheric composition had actively turned against itself. This was not mere haunting, it was territorial reclamation by brute geological force. One unusually cold October night, during a violent thunderstorm that naturally amplified the external air's chaos, I decided to confront the anomaly directly. I was down in my vault, meticulously logging my collection of antique fire-starting kits, flint shards, ferrocerium rods, and historic matches, all meticulously catalogued and secured. My sole weapon against the inevitable was rigorous external documentation. I opened the heavy, secure storage case for a pristine 1890s steel Bowie knife, known for its exceptional blade integrity. Normally, the case and its immediate surroundings were sterile and safe. But as I pried open the stiff locks, a wave of the familiar, corrosive scent rolled over me: rust, dry earth, decay. The metallic tang intensified, and I noticed that the single, essential glass lid of the security case itself seemed to be physically bulging outwards slightly, as if under immense internal pressure, its entire surface distorted and warped by something beyond its structural capacity. The thick glass was visibly bowing inwards, under forces unknown. Then, the true horror, the singular auditory hallucination that revealed the entity's chilling objective, emanated from the very space where the Bowie knife was stored. The precise, methodical movement of my hands toward the knife suddenly stopped. The silence in the vault became absolute, absolute and pressurized at the deepest core of my hearing. And then, from the void of the antique box, I heard a new sound, unnervingly clear and crisp, yet inherently wrong, a sound that seemed to emanate from the precise point where the knife was meant to be, a rapid series of crisp, satisfying clicks, followed by the drawn-out, wet slurp of something impossibly dense and soft being drawn with great effort through a narrow opening. It was the sound of something substantial, something almost liquid, being consumed or extracted from the place where the knife should have been. The sound wasn't of digestion, it was of possession of void. My scientific mind fought reality. Blades don't extract soil, they cut it. And metal doesn't have vocal mouths. But the sounds were too precise, too deliberate to be audio illusions. I abandoned the knife, snatching my high-intensity forensic flashlight and pointing its beam directly into the empty archive box. And there, nestled within the dark velvet lining of the display cavity, at the center of the now absent Bowie knife's position, was the damning, irrefutable evidence. Not the collection itself, but its phantom imprint. A perfectly formed, negative outline of the Bowie knife's exact dimensions, pressed directly into the velvet lining, as if the material itself was deeper and more substantial where the knife had been, a visual imprint of where the object should have been. Not an indentation, but a subtle, chilling optical depression, as if the very fabric of space had compressed around the void. The reality settled heavier than any concrete foundation at that moment. I was not dealing with a simple poltergeist. I was experiencing structural vandalism on a scale that defied my most fundamental concepts of physical being. Something was not stealing my artifacts. It was removing the very essence of their existence, replacing it with something else. The scents, the sounds, the visual voids, they were the calling card of an entity that targeted specific, cherished aspects of human collection, using the very physical spaces they occupied as its primary access point to manipulate my senses. My obsession shifted from collecting the past to defending the present. I began a desperate, solitary campaign of sealing. Using tons of industrial, military anti-radon concrete sealant and miles of galvanized steel mesh, I fortified every wall, every access point, every hidden void in my house. Every nook, every cranny, every known structure received the aggressive treatment required to repel any potential sensory invasion. I poured sealant into forgotten crawl spaces, jackhammered and reinforced weakening foundations, and filled every known architectural flaw in my 42 years of professional life. The climax of this desperate defense arrived one brutally cold, moonless night. My final remaining sanctuary was the garage attached to the house, currently housing my vintage Ford F-150 pickup truck and all the heavy construction equipment I still maintained under my obsessive watch. I had sealed the 20 by 40 foot space against all known ingress, a final bastion of controlled, masculine solitude. I was working inside the garage, cleaning the fuel injection system of the truck, my full attention focused on the precise mechanics of the engine. The air was thick with the familiar smell of lubricant, exhaust fumes, and the underlying, intrusive scent of dry earth, mineral salts, and that sickly sweet, rotting tobacco smoke. The smell was my constant companion, the olfactory evidence of this unwelcome guest. And then I heard it again, different from its usual manifestation, not the sound of consumption or of physical removal, but a sharp, clear, singular scratch on the inside of the garage door, a sound not made by a rat, nor by casual scratching, but by something metallic and very, very sharp against the steel. It was a sound that indicated focused aggression against a physical impediment. I froze instantly, tool in hand, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from the exact point of the garage's exterior door, the one I had sealed shut as the last remaining entry point between my fortress and the outside world. I slowly, agonizingly, retrieved my heavy-duty tactical flashlight from the truck's dashboard. I pointed the beam toward the service door, the target of the recent metallic attack. The single, bright beam pierced the oppressive darkness. Silence. No rat. I lowered the light slightly. The door was perfectly intact, no visible damage. But then I looked down. On the pristine, thick concrete floor just to the left of the doorframe, resting on the otherwise uncluttered surface, was my solution. My specialized chisel, a solid block of hardened steel used for breaking concrete, made of dense metal, was now deeply embedded point down about 2 inches into the thick concrete floor, standing perfectly upright like some sort of grim, unwanted monument. The heavy chisel had been driven into the floor 2 inches deep, with absolutely no external force, no accompanying sound of impact, and no explanation that fit the known laws of physics. The chisel, specifically the very tool I used to test the strength of solid foundation, was now piercing the earth below, a statement from the entity that my own strength and material definition of the world was its own domain. The final, terrifying realization occurred when I picked up the heavy chisel. It felt wrong, impossibly warm, as if it had been held in a furnace and then immediately plunged into its current, impossible, concrete grave. And beside the imprint left by the chisel, pressed into the floor itself, was a single, etched footprint, the size of my entire boot, but distinctly non-human, its shape subtly too long, too narrow, implying something made of dense metal, and shaped not with an arch, but with a flat, solid base. And finally, accompanying the visual evidence of the impossible carving, a new sound had started, a low, pervasive hum emanating from somewhere beneath the floor itself, a vibration that felt less like machinery and more like the resonant feedback of a massive, active, internal magnetic field actively attempting to pull me towards it. I abandoned my truck. I abandoned my tools. I ran from the garage and did not stop until I was miles away, covering the distance with nothing but my own raw, animal terror. The constructor, a being of sheer architectural malice, had not merely haunted my possessions, it had targeted the very definition of my reality, the physical laws I depended upon, proving that any structure, any tool, anything I relied on for its inherent physical definition, could be fundamentally overridden and defined by its own terrible, impossible presence. The power of the entity remained entirely unknown, but the truth of its malice was absolute. It was not bound by the laws of physics, but rather, it was the conductor those laws obeyed. These entities, the true invaders of sterile space, do not steal your object. They reclaim the existence of the ground you believed you owned, piece by devastating piece. I now live in a chaotic, temporary geodesic dome outside of Vegas, where the air is hot, the ground is sand, and no construction can ever be called permanent again. The knowledge of their patient, persistent, fundamentally logical assault on human structure, on the very idea of solid ground, remains the ultimate testament to a predator defined by absolute physical and sensory precision. Story 4. 5 hours on a gravel access road. That is less than a delivery schedule and more like an existential commitment. You generally don't think about demons when you're 3 states deep into a transport contract, but that is exactly how the entire trajectory of my life rearranged itself that night. When you hit a piece of earth where the land itself screams, your entire professional life becomes irrelevant. My name is Ray Cooper. I was a specialized dry goods and tour route specialist, a high-value freight expediter known for delivering materials to obscure, hostile, remote locations. The biggest paycheck of my career hinged on a single, silent contract: haul 8 tons of high-grade, food additive mineral salts, simple, crystalline sodium chloride, to the deepest, loneliest corner of the continental United States, a completely defunct, abandoned relic salt mine located high in an old, dead geological caldera deep in the heart of the Nevada desert. The place was listed on maps only by its coded reference, Pardue Salt Complex, code Alpha 9. My convoy was a single, long-haul trailer, a heavy, air-conditioned isolation booth driven by one severely sleep-deprived man, me, with nothing for company but the drone of the huge diesel engine and the sight of endless, flat, dead scrubland. The final stretch of the delivery was an unpaved, unmarked service road that felt aggressively hostile, the truck grinding over sharp, calcified white desert rock, kicking up a thick, choking white sand dust cloud into the dry, high-altitude air. Getting closer, the environmental conditions became intensely unusual. The air temperature, already brutally cold due to the altitude and the deep desert night, dropped violently and acutely inside the cab, not because of a mechanical failure, but a profound thermal vacuum created by the approaching mine entrance. The entire landscape was bathed in a singular atmospheric phenomenon localized entirely against the side of the dry mountainside. A profound, cold stillness that seemed to absorb all ambient noise. The single, largest natural generator of sound, the drone of the massive diesel engine, was inexplicably muted the closer I got to the mine, its roar progressively diminishing in volume, as if its acoustic energy was being actively sucked into the heavy, dry mineral air. The mine structure was an enormous, black industrial ruin carved directly into the high desert wall, a massive, rusted steel loading conveyor, a collapsing steel-sided millhouse, and most prominently, the single, large, dark access opening of the shaft, a wide, rectangular structural void leading straight into an incomprehensible underground darkness. The massive area was actively covered by a low, rhythmic, almost continuous electrical blue light, a cold, pulsating, artificial electrical source that kept the area softly, menacingly static and artificially illuminated, despite all power being officially removed decades ago. My initial approach froze into paralysis when my high-beam headlights confirmed the true structural terror. Perfectly centered on the massive loading deck that led into the deepest entry point of the dry mine shaft, arranged in a chilling and terrifyingly precise pattern, stood perhaps 100 heavy, industrial-sized burlap sacks, each filled with dense, unquantifiable material. These were not random sacks. They were perfectly spaced, organized into a single, massive, intricate spiral glyph pattern that radiated outward from the pitch-dark center of the shaft. They looked like an immense, silent, multi-patterned sacrifice awaiting final consignment. And sitting precisely at the physical apex of the terrifying spiral, directly over the hole into the earth, was a single, large, industrial-grade black husk, a dense, organic mass that resembled a heavily charred, life-sized human torso, slumped over a low, dry, polished granite altar. It reeked of highly concentrated, sweet decaying human organic matter and dry black ozone. It was the centerpiece of a profoundly organized, territorial, and ongoing ritual. I started logging the scene instantly in my mind with a singular descriptor, the salt purge votive. The mine felt entirely hostile. It felt dedicated to an aggressive, ritualistic cleansing of something profound. My full, terrifying confirmation came through the ultimate psychological assault, the sound of the votive. Still sitting frozen in the diesel cab, I slowly turned the ignition key, cutting the massive power supply. The profound, immediate silence was total, instantly filled by two distinct, terrifying auditory outputs that pierced my soul with cold precision. The first was the single, rhythmic, mechanical sound of heavy, dry salt crystals being aggressively and rhythmically swept across a massive expanse of polished, flat stone, coming from somewhere deep inside the dry shaft. The sound was high frequency, continuous, and systematic, indicating an endless cleansing action in the darkness below, designed only for the pure removal of dust or organic detritus. The second sound, the source of absolute terror, came directly from the core of the salt purge votive, the black, charred torso arranged over the granite altar. It was a single, clear, terrifying male human voice, speaking quickly, deliberately, and with an intense, agonized certainty. The vessel is cold. The burden is complete. The purge demands the replacement. You are the witness, Ray. Deliver your burden, then enter the service. The psychological violation was total, comprehensive, and specific, a physical, audio-enabled entity, fully aware of my personal transportation, my cargo, the pure salt, my name, and the immediate proximity of my single point of escape. The demon wasn't just performing a ritual. It was a deeply organized contractual entity demanding the final, scheduled delivery of the pure mineral salt to complete the ritual and secure my entry for the service. The subsequent 2-hour agonizing standoff was a desperate series of failures against the organized structural malice. The entity now targeted my only exit strategy, my physical freedom to move. I fought my intense, profound terror, trying to climb out of the truck cab to unhook the long-haul trailer filled with salt. As my hand reached for the latch to the escape door, the rhythmic salt-sweeping sound inside the shaft would instantly double in frequency. intensifying to a sound of sheer, dry, mechanical rage, sending a powerful wave of pure, dry electrical static charge through my control wheel. I immediately reseated my hand. The entity's structural purpose was clear. Do not interfere with the protocol. Your work is to deliver the salt and remove yourself on the entity's precise terms. I understood the essential requirement of the ritual. The entity was purifying its structural core, the endless physical sweeping, and demanding one final, complete replacement: the warm, breathing body of the single man who delivered the final contract. The structural terror intensified as I remained resistant to its psychological control. The lights outside the massive shaft, the pulsing, mechanical blue light, which had been a single, ambient field, began to intensify its rhythmic pulse and then started to rotate like a massive, internalized lighthouse focused on two highly specific spots of white earth around the periphery of the sacrifice. I instantly recognized the two high-density spots, two immense, shallow, perfectly cut-out human silhouette outlines, cut into the bedrock just outside the ritual's core. The immense energy of the blue light was literally scouring the two large voids clean of all dust and atmosphere in preparation for a new structural occupant. Then the salt sweeping ceased. The blue light froze. The core black, kneeling husk on the altar delivered its final, decisive sound, a loud, clear, human, aggressive scream of ultimate frustration and refusal, now completely distorted into an aggressive, grinding baritone, completely lacking the measured control of the earlier communication. He must provide the wax seal. The purge will now expand into the container. ARC Y, WYO, WYO. The three-letter codes, my last recorded radio delivery codes for Wyoming. The sound attack broke my professional cynicism for good. I realized the profound depth of the entity's contractual connection with my life was not just local, but systemic, encompassing my entire routing history and financial record. It was ready to take not my location, but my entire professional existence as the final structural payment. I threw off the door latch and burst from the cab, not to haul the massive salt container, but to achieve a desperate, non-compliant, non-ritualistic structural contamination of the entire complex. I raced to the massive, rear-loading hatch of my own insulated body trailer. I opened the main pressure seal with a savage twist and, using all my 200 pounds of human weight, pulled the entire first layer of highly controlled dry, concentrated, pure sodium chloride onto the exposed gravel road immediately next to the sacrifice. I violently emptied the full half-ton consignment of required material into a huge, white, anti-structural mountain of salt waste, ensuring the pure essence of the delivery was absolutely and entirely outside the ritual's circumference and contamination zone. The intentional waste of a high-value material was the only non-compliant act of psychological refusal left in my power. The result was an immediate, massive wave of atmospheric retaliation. The enormous mountain landscape surrounding the salt mine immediately began to project a single, simultaneous, rhythmic, profound, agonizing human weeping that sounded like 1,000 lonely male voices, all crying out in unison from the deepest part of the surrounding cliffs, an overwhelming, all-consuming, acoustic flood of profound, absolute grief focused onto the immediate zone of the abandoned salt. I ran from my surrendered cargo and reached a single telephone pole a mile out from the complex, collapsing violently onto the dry scrubland. I called my contact, delivered one final sentence. The delivery is made, but the location is compromised. Abort all future transport on the Pardue Salt Line. I am no longer a logistics specialist. I sold the trailer, bought a small, heavily insulated farm in the most benign farmland region of rural Wisconsin, miles from any aggressive geological or saline material. I live on the fat of the land, surrounded by water-rich, neutral earth, refusing to engage in any activity that promotes dryness, high-frequency energy projection, or extreme isolation. The terrifying truth is that the salt purge votive wasn't a ritual of purification. It was simply a highly organized, generational contract of human sacrifice fulfilled by the delivery of chemical purification, requiring the living operator as its ultimate, final seal. The land still screams, I know, whenever the blue light fades. And I still carry the absolute, chilling knowledge that I escaped service by violently contaminating the ritual, leaving the weeping sacrifice of the 1,000 lonely souls in the empty desert air to deal with their own profound, chemical non-compliance. My reward is my perpetual silence. Story 5. Commuting. The true tragedy of physical relocation isn't the distance overcome. It's the unnerving psychological realization that the distance is actively overcoming you. You become a predictable point mass on a cold schedule, interchangeable with the next body that follows, utterly passive. This loss of personal agency consumed my entire reality every morning and evening. I am Arthur Vance. For 7 consecutive years, my personal hell was the 19-minute commute aboard the 5:17 p.m. MTA Regional Rail line, a brutal, high-speed, soul-eroding transit from the sterile, vertical purgatory of midtown Manhattan out to the cold, distant conformity of central New Jersey suburbia. Life had been boiled down to an internal combustion engine, an unchanging track line, and the single, low-frequency hum of a packed passenger car. My personal refuge, established with territorial tenacity, was the third car from the front, a single bench seat set precisely against the thick aluminum wall toward the rear, where the large, smoked window provided a necessary, insulating distance from the predictable chaos of the other passengers. It was my single box of predictable noise and geometry. The phenomena began exactly 4 months after a significant schedule change that added a permanent, slow, 1-mile detour through a heavily forested, unlit section of abandoned industrial park, a route the dispatcher, who sounded exhausted by the very word, referred to only as the dead spur. It was a permanent fracture in the schedule, occurring precisely halfway through the entire 90-minute commute, plunging the high-powered train into 10 minutes of absolute, external darkness. It started with a profound, structural acoustic dissonance located entirely beneath my personal seat in the third passenger railcar. The noise was faint, but deeply persistent, a low, thick, cyclical thunka that vibrated up through the worn leatherette seat material and into the core of my spine. It was a secondary rhythm, completely out of sync with the primary, heavy metallic whir shhhhh of the wheels and transmission. The new vibration felt less like a mechanical imbalance, and more like the sound of an immense, perfectly centered organ being played just under the single spot where I perpetually sat. I dismissed it as structural decay. These carriages were old, overused, prone to chronic problems. But the sound always intensified precisely as the train entered the black vacuum of the dead spur, a peak acoustic dissonance that assaulted my body with deep, subvocal pressure, the sound of an immense, buried heart beating its final rhythm for the one human in the train whose presence it seemed to allow. The structural dissonance spread a new, complete, psychological terror, the shadow seat occupant. I had been working frantically on my thin, commercial-grade black laptop in my usual seat, the intense acoustic pressure focusing up my spine. The train plunged into the total external darkness of the dead spur detour. The external sound ceased entirely, replaced by the profound, high-pressure internal air vacuum that always accompanied the isolation. I glanced up, my eyes straining in the dim, internalized overhead carriage lights. And I looked directly across the aisle at the highly familiar, perpetually empty seat that sat one position directly across from mine. And in that empty seat, leaning heavily against the smudged window, sat an individual. Not a shadow. Not a physical passenger who had come and sat down instantly. A profoundly detailed, cold, silent, and entirely spectral man dressed in perfectly replicated, outdated corporate commuter uniform. A heavy, mid-20th century gray herringbone suit, a thick leather attaché resting exactly between his feet. His skin was the color of perfectly dry, cold, gray plaster, his expression fixed in a silent, dead paralysis, a man perpetually waiting for a destination that no longer existed. He was a silent, unmoving ghost of the commute. The terrifying visual aberration lasted for 5 seconds. His eyes, intensely and profoundly white and non-reflective of any light source, found my gaze and held it a single, unending moment of terror and frozen, ancient apathy. Then, as the train abruptly emerged from the thick blackness of the detour and the primary internal carriage lights surged back to full capacity, the figure vanished aggressively, leaving behind only the profound, cold, aggressive heat of the empty leatherette surface. No ambient residue. No structural flaw. Just a raw, non-reflective volume of light that replaced the entire complex composition of the ancient passenger. But the ghost had left an object, a singular, tactile piece of evidence that violated all logic. Resting precisely in the exact, dead center indentation of the phantom man's seat was a very small, perfectly preserved vintage paper ticket stub from the New Jersey rail lines, the old, archaic style used 2 decades prior. The faded ink on the ticket defied history. Destination, LONGPOINT. Passenger, 1. Date, 03/17/YY. Long Point was an old, defunct maintenance shed precisely in the center of the dead spur detour. It was the final, unrecoverable destination of the structural deviation. The confrontation transformed my perception from a commuter of distance to an unwilling participant in an aggressive temporal trapping. I was being inducted into the rhythm of a silent, focused tragedy centered around a single, repetitive track line deviation. And my seat, the focal point of the external thunka-thunka, had been intentionally compromised to capture my essence. The aggressive acoustic pressure began to speak, directly, personally, and without the aid of a human language. After multiple nights of this horrific presence and ticket exchange, I placed a highly sensitive microacoustic sensor beneath my seat for objective audio validation. The subsequent playback revealed the full acoustic truth. There was no natural, mechanical imbalance. The rhythm of the sub-seat structural dissonance was artificially generated, composed of 2 specific, repeating, overlapping sounds. The first sound was the single, rhythmic thunka-thunka of the immense engine. The second, synchronized, non-metallic sound was a clear, wet, desperate, rhythmic slurp, slurp, slurp. The sound, as confirmed by my technical analysis, of a massive, complex piece of dense, organic material being repeatedly and violently sucked clean out of a vast, cylindrical cavity, precisely aligned with the rhythmic structural cadence of the passing train. The entity in Long Point was feeding from below on its own trap structure, using my physical, sitting body as the ultimate conduit to synchronize its core rhythm. The psychological pressure eventually forced a catastrophic psychological failure, a deliberate, aggressive, structural avoidance of my dedicated seat. I left my seat in the third car abandoned and fled to the very front car, sitting in the aisle, miles away from the intense structural rhythm that had taken over my physical life. But isolation proved impossible. The moment I physically changed my assigned station, the entity demonstrated an immense, aggressive, structural speed by directly rewriting the internal physical environment of the other, sealed rail cars to ensure my psychological proximity. The total internal power grid in the next 2 carriages instantly and violently failed, plunging the carriages into total darkness. My physical location in the very front car, separated by a thin strip of aluminum wall, was now facing the terrifying, overwhelming blackness of the 2 completely silent, suddenly dead and structurally cold compartments. The only ambient acoustic noise in the entire 3-car spectrum was the final, rhythmic, precise sound of the deep-seated thunka-thunka slurp emanating aggressively from its distant fixed point 5 carriage lengths away, amplified with sudden, total acoustic precision toward my scared, exposed place in the aisle. The single focus of the sound was now purely on me, ensuring that my relocation was impossible, and my human panic was the only emotional content in the massive structural void it had created. A massive, directed acoustic signal meant to return me to its preferred physical station. The terror reached its absolute climax when the ghost entity attempted a full psychological replacement. I was pinned in the aisle, watching the unlit windows. From the external carriage window's opaque, black reflective surface, in the sudden burst of track reflection from a momentary external light flash, just as the train accelerated wildly out of the detour, I saw an immense, profound reflection, the cold, aggressive, white-eyed, gray-suited image of the shadow seat occupant was now perfectly positioned directly and identically in my aisle window location. Staring out with absolute stillness, his form possessing the single reflection in the entire carriage. And directly beneath the reflection of the static, cold figure, on the window's lower seal, a single, minuscule piece of paper suddenly appeared to materialize, resting on the interior glass edge. It was another single, antique paper ticket stub, exactly the same as the others. But this ticket's destination was chilling, absolute, passenger, A. VANC. Destination, INVENTORY. I was fully booked. The ghost wasn't just haunting the train, it was hunting for a replacement unit to fill its desolate space now that Mim's technical consciousness had collapsed on the other frequency. I pulled open the massive internal emergency door latch connecting to the next, unlit, silent carriage, abandoning my entire worldly position to step violently into the pitch-dark, acoustic isolation of the electrically failed carriage. I didn't care about the risk of structural fracture or collision. It didn't matter. Only, as my sole foot hit the cold, dark floor of the unlit carriage, I heard a sound that turned my blood to absolute ice. 3 feet away, directly emanating from the dark space where I had just moved into his domain, an almost mechanical sound of heavy, static, synthetic fabric, the dry, heavy sound of an antiquated raincoat, being lifted, followed by a profound, cold guttural snarl that had no vocal component. A pure expression of immediate, personal, electrical hatred for my unexpected intrusion. I retreated violently, pulled the passenger emergency stop cord so hard it ripped out of the ceiling panel and shattered the internal light. I didn't stop running until the massive train was forced to jerk violently onto the external track. I ran to the cab, broke the conductor's door, and burst out into the chaotic, terrifying human noise of the station itself, sacrificing my entire professional life to escape the rhythmic, terrifying structural invitation of the train's possessed engine and its structural malfeasance. I now live in a 2-story wooden house that is deliberately structurally unsound in the dense, dry internal air of the Rocky Mountains, far from any commercial rail line. I have a chronic phobia of prolonged, rhythmic machine noise and single, consistent spatial paths. The shadow seat occupant still rides the 5:17 p.m., still possessing his singular reflection, waiting patiently in the cold stillness of the train for the schedule's rhythm to pull the single, warm, predictable source of rhythmic human life that will finally agree to take its seat. My entire previous perception of life, the cold, structural predictability I based my life on, died in that frantic, terrifying moment of transit into the darkness.